Good morning and welcome to another ACT Chess Association Twitch stream covering the online events that are being held in Canberra, Australia, while the chess clubs aren't meeting face to face. My name is Sean Press. I organise these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association and normally do these stream summaries the day after the event. The ACT Chess Association runs 3 events during the week. We have a Monday Blitz, a Wednesday Rapid tournament, and a Thursday long time control tournament. And the game I'm taking is from the Thursday long time control tournament, which was round 2 of our August series. These are normally 6-week events, 1 round a week, and they normally attract about 20 players to them. And the game I'm looking at today was between Sully Avancible as white and Tim Pearce as black. A bit of a warning. If you aren't a fan of rook and pawn endings, stay tuned and keep watching, because you should be a fan of rook and pawn endings, and more importantly, if you want to become a better chess player, mastering some simple rook and pawn endings is an easy way to get there. So let's just start looking at the game. The time limit for this game, by the way, was 45 minutes plus 15 seconds per move, and both players used pretty much all their time, by the way. So this game went for close to 2 hours. And we start with e4, c5, c3. The c3 Sicilian is actually not a bad anti-Sicilian system, and I'm playing it at the moment, so I'm a bit of a fan. The idea, of course, is you just want to support the d4 push, and if black captures, you can take back with your c-pawn. d5 was played in this game, knight f6, e5, knight d5, d4 is the other main way of playing it, and there are a few other lines as well. But after d5, white took, takes back with the queen. Now, the slight drawback of the c3 Sicilian is apparent in this line. Normally, you want to play your knight. So let me just get my arrow right. Finger slip, which always happens in online activities. Knight to c3, hitting the queen, and you chase the queen around a bit. With the pawn on c3, of course, this doesn't happen. So d4 instead, knight c6. Knight f3 is a sensible line. You can always play something like pawn takes pawn here, which I've played a few times against Tim Pearce, by the way. Black gets given the choice of playing queen takes c5, bishop e3, and white's going for a lead in development, knowing that the knight on b1 is slightly harder to develop because of the pawn on c3. Or after queen takes, king takes, we get into what I call the take the money and run variation. It's not quite given that name, but the idea is that white will try and hang on to this c-pawn. Can't castle, king in the center, but wants to try and hang on to the second c-pawn as much as possible. And as I said, I've played this against Tim Pearce a few times, and generally I've been successful in hanging on to that pawn and then eventually converting. But in this game, knight f3, bishop g4 is pretty good here. And bishop e2 is fine. I've spectacularly mucked up this position as white a couple of times, by the way. The other line, if you want to play it slightly safer, is bishop e3, and after bishop takes, queen takes. It's just a nice long line here, and I'm going to show you. Queen takes, g takes, c takes, c takes. Surprisingly, various engines I've got give this is equal. And at first glance it isn't, because of the wrecked up pawn structure for white, isolated d pawn plus doubled f pawns. But 2 bishops and a lead in development gives white enough chances and enough development, because even after knight c3, which is a pawn sacrifice basically, even knight takes d4 castles, knight back to c6, bishop to b5. White actually, there's a long sequence that comes after this, but white will end up winning either a raggedy c-pawn or even picking up the a-pawn through to the simple threat of just swapping on c6 and taking on a7. So the fact that white manages to develop all these pieces, still has terrible pawn structure, and is down a pawn, but still has at least an equal position, goes to show you that in some positions, especially like this, piece activity really is important. But enough of that little lecture. Bishop e2 was played instead. So we take, e6, knight c3 to hit the queen, goes across to a5, castles is fine. So we get to this next position here, which is basically a fairly common position that comes out in this opening, and that is that white ends up with an isolated d-pawn. Because of the c3 capture and the capture with the e-pawn. The d-pawn ends up on its own, and we get all those constant themes that I've spoken about in the last few weeks about the isolated queen pawn. Just from white's point of view here, all these arrows kind of mean something. You've got semi-open or open files to put your rooks on, the c-file and the e-file, of course. The pawn is covering e5 and c5, so your minor pieces like the knight might end up in there. And then eventually you're also looking at a push from d4 to d5 to open up the position as well. This position does have some advantages for black as well. The key one that I tend to notice for the moment is that the bishop on g4 has got there before pawn e6. And if you're kind of swapping things off to try and gang up on this pawn, having the bishop on c4 is not g4 is not a bad place for it. Knight f6, and good move. We're looking at keeping d5 under control, so that pawn push doesn't quite fly. So bishop e3, bishop here, queen b3, hitting b7. Queen b4 is the right move here, I think, because the exchange of queens is actually fine for black. Remember that if you're playing against the isolated pawn, the fewer the pieces on the board, the more likely it is to be a liability in the ending. Knight takes b4, going for the El Cheapo knight c2 kind of idea here, doesn't really pay off. Bishop b5 check, king d8, knight e5, and white is a lot better in this position. So bishop takes b4 is the right capture. a3, and black could take here on c3, b takes, but you're giving up the two bishops. You're kind of repairing white's pawn structure. After knight d5, rook ac1, we have a different middle game position, and we have what's generally known as, once the pawn pushes to c4, we're known as hanging pawns. And that's a different way of treating them. If you do want to do a bit of light reading while in lockdown, Nimzovich's My System covers a lot of this stuff, and it's worth reading as the kind of starting point. There are other books that are more modern on that one, but it's always worth going to the starting point. Read My System first, and then read the more modern books on positional game stuff, because a lot of them just start with Nimzovich as the starting point. So bishop e7 instead, h3, punt the bishop back. When I was analysing this game, of course, Fritz or Stockfish or whatever I use as an engine says g4. I'm always suspicious about these moves. Having said that, it got played later. Queen's off, you can get away with playing this move a bit better. And then after bishop g6, knight e5 gives white a better position with the knight being placed on e5. And if you ask yourself, why can't we take? The general answer is because of this. And suddenly, white's got all this space on the king side, looking at trapping the bishop on g6 after f5. And also the knight can go to b5, and c7 and d6 are also squares that the knight would like to go to. And again, queen's off, you're not worried about king safety, but you are focusing on piece activity. As a point I was going to make in this one, at various points during this game, if you want to get a little bit of practice at playing positions like this position that I've got here is a good place to start. Feed it into your computer, take the white pieces, see how well you can do and how black fights back. Instead, rook fd1, not a bad idea, getting in behind that passed pawn, that isolated pawn. So rook d8, here we go. A few more moves, developing a6 to stop knight b5. b4 is a good move here. Castles. By the way, my engine keeps screaming at g4, 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 g4. Knight to a4, and this is part of the idea now, is that the knight is looking at going to c5. There's also the open file for the moment. So knight d5, knight c5. And if you notice that the knight is attacking both the b7 pawn and the a6 pawn, this setup of the two pawns on b7, a6 being hit by the knight on c5, in this position isn't so critical, but is actually a good trick for endings to remember. If you see this pawn structure, dropping the knight onto c5, or the equivalent of c4 if you're black and you're looking at pawns on b2 and a3, is a trick that has won me more than my fair share of endings over the years. So keep it in mind. In this case, black takes, and white takes with the rook, because white wants to keep that file open for the rooks. Knight back to e7. Now g4 gets played. Okay, back, and then knight e5 gets played. So the idea that was being asked for, at least by the analysis engine way back here, does happen just a few moves later at move 22. Bishop e4 is the right place to go. You can't play f3 at this point because you just hang the bishop on e3. So bishop d2 was one idea, preparing f3. Bishop d3 got played here, and black unfortunately started to get himself in a bit of a tangle here. Bishop takes d3 is the right move, even swapping off. Knight takes, and after b6 to drive the rook away, rook back, rook here is basically good for black, and the position is pretty equal now. If rooks get swapped off, black actually is slightly better because of control of the c file, and if white then tries to challenge by swapping another pair of rooks, the d pawn becomes more of a liability because there's less and less pieces on the board. It stops being an attacking pawn in terms of playing d5 to open the position and becomes a defensive liability where white has to keep the pieces on that pawn to stop it getting captured. So bishop went to d3 and the knight took here on e3 instead. Okay, that's fine. F takes. But now black needed the swap. Here on d3, knight takes. And again with b6, and the idea is to drive the rook to an unfavourable square, noting that if you try and be super duper active with rook c7, knight d5 unfortunately forks the pawn on e3 and the rook on c7. And after rook c back to c1, we play rook c8 as before. And again, we've just got an equal position. Not as bad for white because the pawn on e3 defends d4, but at the same time, black is okay. And also, there's a trick about looking at pawn structures and counting up the number of separated groups of pawns. And the less of them you have, the better off you are. So white has 3 of them. Queen side, middle of the board, king side, while black only has 2 of them. And the idea is that pawns in groups do defend each other. But the more groups you have, the more stragglers, I suppose, which are the ones on a3, e3, and h3 you've got to worry about. Instead, after f takes e3, bishop c6 looked okay, but black had just missed a tactic here, which white spotted pretty quickly, which is knight takes, and then bishop takes a6. And of course, if you take on a6, then the rook on c6 hangs. Having said that, bishop e4 was also worth looking at. After rook d6 to defend, you double again, so you're still threatening to capture on c6 twice. And after rook c8, there's another nice way of starting to win material, and that is simply to play a4. And you're going to play b5 here. And because of the pin, you are threatening basically to win a piece in this position. And I think in the end, black has to bail by giving up a pawn. Instead, bishop takes a6 is fine, but it does allow the desperado knight takes d4. If we play rook takes d4, rook takes d4, he takes, king f2, rook d8, king e3. We get a similar position than what happened in the game, but with one pair of rooks, which is slightly easier to defend in the short term. But we did end up getting to an ending very similar to this. So e takes d4 instead. B takes a6, rook c6 here, so we're hitting the a pawn, and this forces this rook to go to a8, and so white is better in this ending. Not winning, but better, because the black rooks are kind of still a little bit passive, while the white rooks are a little bit more active, especially the rook on c6. So the goal for black is to start to try and work out a way of activating the rooks. Sometimes you can even be down a pawn, but as long as you've got active rooks, you're able to survive. So when I said at the top, if you don't like rook endings, you should. Now is the time to really start focusing, because there's a lot of good ideas for both sides in here. So, king f2. So what white's plan is going to do is first defend that d pawn with the king, and that frees the rooks to doing other things. So rook f d8 to attack, king e3. g6 was played, and it kind of makes sense, because in the end you don't want to fall for any back rank mate tricks. But rook d5, again, activity. Rook here, and then you just give up the a pawn is one idea. I'm not 100% sure it's the right idea and it'll work, but still it's better than passive defense. And we play rook takes d4, and you've kind of got to play rook c3 here to stop the rook check on d3, and then h5, and the goal here is to try and start breaking up the pawns, because after pawn takes pawn you can start swinging the rook over and attacking the h pawn on h3 and the pawn on h5. The only worry I've got is that the b pawn especially has already started the run to the end of the board. It's going to be a little bit faster than any black pawns coming through, but with active rooks it's a lot harder to win. So g6, rook to c7, and now after rook d5, rook f1 is a nice move. f7 becomes the target, If you swing the black rook across to f8, then you run into trouble with the rook on c7 just goes to a7, and then then it's going to be quite tricky because the a pawn's incredibly weak. f5, we could play rook c5 here to offer the swap of rooks. After f takes, h takes, double the rooks, rook takes, rook c1, rook g5, rook c6. Slightly better for white, especially after the a pawn goes, but again, it's one of these endings where both sides have lots of chances, and if you're sitting on a good position in a rook and pawn ending, it's often better to try and keep that good position for as long as you can before you give your opponent a chance of victory. So g takes f5, e takes f5 was played there. It gives black, a passed pawn, and that becomes important later, as we'll see. Rook c5 now offering the swap. Rook d8, swap and swap, rook c1, king f7. Rook d6 was a lot safer here. I know I've said you've got to be active, and this is a passive move, but sometimes the alternatives just don't work for you, and you've just got to choose a move like this. Because after king f7, rook c7. And black followed up with the very active king e6, but it does drop the h pawn. The other thought, if you went back, which is very passive, I'll just show you how this tends to work now. Because this is a lesson in being active. Rook to a6, c6, sorry, to win the a6 pawn. f4, king f4 here, rook f5. You have to play king f3, and after rook d5, takes and takes. There's a slight advantage here for white, and I think white would probably still win this position because the a pawn and the b pawn. Coming back here, just to show you how quickly it all can go wrong in a rook and pawn ending. After rook f5, if you just grab the pawn here, suddenly f3, and white's turn to win into a loss, because rook c6, f2, rook c1, and we make a queen. Now I'm going to show you just a couple more moves, even though you're going, hang on, this is just king and rook versus king. But with the extra pawns, there's always a faint hope that the white king or the white pawns might be able to run it down the board. But I'll just show you a nice simple tactical idea here. You can use a4, we hit the a pawn, you play a5, and then you just play rook a4. And you're hitting the b pawn, and you're hitting the a pawn, and you're going to pick up one of them. And once you've won one of them, you're going to win two of them. So, all the way back here, king e6 was played, rook h takes h7. a5 is not a bad idea because we want to try and eliminate as many pawns as possible. Rook b7 is the best response. And we take, and we take. And after king f6, so we've basically got an extra pawn. White's got two passes, which are currently protected. Black has got one. Should be a win for white. But again, just to show you how tricky it is, when I pumped this one into the analysis engine, and computers for a long time were notoriously bad at endings because they just couldn't look far enough. It went rook b8, g5, for example, b5, king e7. And if you run pawn to b6 like this, rook b5 actually should draw this position. King to d3, f4, king to e4, rook to d6, rook to b7, king to f6, d5. And it gives white a slight edge, but there's a lot of work to do before you're going to absolutely convert this position, mainly because this f pawn is still a little bit tricky here. A human might see a plan such as rook c7, rook c6, swap rooks. The black king runs across to try and stop the pawns from queening. The white, on the other hand, has just got to worry about this happening. But if you play something like h4 to break the pawns up, you might be able to get away with capturing both these pawns and then coming across and winning that. That's a really human way of looking at the ending because you've just listed a series of steps to do it. Engines don't do that. They will just calculate as far as they can. So h4 was played, and I like h4 again from a human point of view. The idea is to kind of keep the king from coming to g4 if you check on g5, if you check on b6. But again, the engine went, no. And this wasn't the best move, and I'll show you why in a second. f4 check, king e4, rook f5. It was played in the game, similar to the line. But at this point, playing f3 was the right move. I haven't particularly analysed what happens where the king takes the rook, but if the king takes the rook, you just play f2 and house white stopping black from making a queen. They could try for the trick of something like this. I'll just wind it in. You could try for this sneaky trick here of checking behind, but you know, a move like this, and what are you going to do eventually? Or even just to short circuit the trick. Go here, and I can't go there. It's a little bit messy. You've just got to make sure that the rook can't get here, but yeah, this is going to be enough to, I think, to avoid too much damage. And then you're going to make a queen. At least. And so having thrown that line in without any prep, if you play king takes f3 instead, then there's rook takes d4. Rook b6, for example, king up, king to g3, and then you just keep checking along here. And if the king comes too far across, you just play your rook to h3. You're going to capture the h-pawn, and then it's just g-pawn running versus b-pawn running, and the position's a draw. Instead, rook f5 looks okay, but after rook b6, king g7, rook to a6, because white really needs to bring the rook around here. f3 is the right idea, okay. But after rook a1, black needed to play a move like rook h5 here. Again, you want to keep your rook active. You want to start eliminating pawns. Sometimes you've got to give away some of your pawns to keep your opponent's pawns under attack. Okay, so king g3, king e3 here, and it's still hard work to win. Not completely winning for white. There's just a lot of moves that need to be played. If white tried to play a move like rook b1 and the idea of just running the pawn as fast as they can, rook takes d4, rook takes king f6 after b5, b6, rook to d8, b7, rook to b8, just in time to block, and this position's a draw as well. So this is the problem with rook and pawn endings, is that you look like you're winning, okay, and it turns out you're not, okay. You feel like you're losing, and it turns out you are. There's an old joke about rook and pawn endings. Terribly hard to win a pawn up, terribly hard to defend a pawn down. So, rook f2, pawn to f2 was played instead, rook f1 to block it, king h6, king to e3, and rook to b5 is the right idea, and we're going to get into a different ending shortly, and this is really important, the ending that we head for. So rook takes here, rook to f4, king to h5, so the goal is to try and at least win the h-pawn. After d5, good idea, rook takes f4, swapping on f4 is a mistake because of king takes, and then there's nothing stopping the pawn from going down, so rook goes to b5 instead, king to d4 to defend, and g5 gets played. And h takes, king takes, and rook f8. Now, this is the other ending I wanted to talk about, and this is a really important ending. And in fact, we end up in what's called the Lucena position, which some of you may or may not know, but this is the ending you need to understand all other rook and pawn endings, according to Jeremy Silman. This is the ending that you need to know. Now, in this case, we've already reached a position where white is completely winning, and so the winning process will be fairly simple and straightforward. The reason why white is completely winning, though, is that the black king is cut off. The rook on f8 is keeping the king 2 files away from the pawn and the king, and this makes the winning strategy quite easy. If it's a rook pawn, a lot trickier, but in a position like this, this is just overwhelmingly winning for white, but we're going to see why. Oh, I've got spammers in my chat. Please ignore the spammers in my chat. Rook f8, cutting the king off, and away we go. So king goes back to g6, okay, and we play d6 here. Rook to b1, okay, king to b5, king to c5, king goes to g7, and in fact, there is a straightforward win in this position with d7. If that was played, what I'm going to show you next I wouldn't be able to show you, which is a shame because I think what I'm about to show you is quite important. But after king takes f8, promote, king back to f7, queen d5 check, and the problem in endings like this, as much as king and rook versus king and queen can be hard to force mate, if the rook is well away from the king, the rook is almost certainly going to come off the board to a queen fork, and we'll do so in a few moves here. The queen will just check until the king and the rook are able to be checked at the same time, attacked at the same time by the queen, and then the rook will fall off the board. Rook f2 is not a bad idea. It just moves the rook to safety, and it allows us to demonstrate the idea that I want to show you. I think I would just want to come back one move. I think I didn't talk about rook c1 check, king b6, rook c2, d7, and again, the problem with that is, of course, d8 is about to happen, and even if the rook goes to d2 to protect it, of course, promotes, rook takes, queen, rook takes, and it's just king and rook versus king. So, rook f2, rook c1, king b6, rook to d1 to attack the pawn, king goes back to c7, rook c1, king d8, rook d1, d7. And this is the Lucena position here. And where basically it's just how you are going to win is because, and I'll show you why you don't win, and then I'll show you what the trick is. But look at the arrow across the board. This is the winning idea. You want to end up with your rook, if you're trying to win this, on either this rank here or the one further up. By the way, confession time, I once got an ending like this, albeit one where it was a knight's pawn on b7, or in fact I think it was g7, g2 because I was black, and I failed to win it, and this was at a chess Olympiad. I turned a surefire win into a very, very annoying draw, and I'm still embarrassed about it to this day. Because imagine rook d3, which was played. If you try and bring your king out straight away so that the pawn can queen, you run into this problem. Rook c3 check, king d6, rook d3 check, and if you play king c5, black just takes the pawn, so there's no good. But if you play king c6 to keep it defended, rook c3, king d5, you check here, and you have to go back and protect the pawn, and then black just keeps checking and the game is a draw. So, to stop that from happening, the key move is rook f4. Note that the king is still 2 files away. It needs to be 2 files away, and that was the blunder I made when I was trying to win this at the Chess Olympiad. I'd forgotten about the keep the king 2 files away bit and couldn't work out what to do next. So, rook f4, and now after rook goes to d1, the game ends pretty quickly. King c7, sure, we check. King goes up, we check again. King goes across to defend the pawn, we check again. King goes up, we check one more time, but now the rook, because it's on the 4th rank, can just go to d4, and now there are no more checks apart from exchanging, and the pawn will become a queen. And black chose the right time to resign in this position. So, there was a heap in that game, and it's a very long broadcast. I think I'm already up to almost half an hour on this one. And you can watch this in parts if you're watching it in replay. But there are a number of key things here. Opening choice was good. There was a little bit of a tactical mistake back here with bishop back to c6. But then once the minor pieces came off, it's about rook activity in the ending. So white got active with the rook, kept black a little bit passive because of the passed pawn. Having said that, there were some black missed the defensive idea of giving away pawns to capture other pawns. And you want to keep trying to simplify eventually. Just as an aside, the reason why we ended up in this position where I pointed out that it was completely winning, where am I going? I'm going back to way back here, I think. Yeah, where I was completely winning here, is the white king was able to get around in front of the pawn. Okay, way back in the position where I was looking at moves like f3, the black king is still on this half of the board, and having black able to get in front of the pawn leads to a different defensive idea, which I'll probably talk about another day, where it's a lot harder to win. If the white king is helping the pawn, then it's easier for white than if the black king is stopping it. So, thanks for tuning in. That's, yeah, a lot of talking there, a lot of coverage of that game. That was from last night's ACT Chess Association Standard event. Played on Thursday nights, 1 round a week, time limit of 45 minutes plus 15 seconds per move. It's a win for Sully Vansbell, who now goes to 2 out of 2, along with 4 other players. Normally around about week 4 or 5, I get a clue about who's likely to win those events. So my name's Sean Press. I run these tournaments on behalf of the ACT Chess Association. I do these summaries the next day. The next event that we're running is Monday next week, and it's a Blitz tournament, so I'll probably pop up again on Tuesday doing the summary. And until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.